Thank you. Welcome, everybody. So before we get started, another quick question for you. What's your level of experience with design thinking? Put this in the Zoom chat on a scale of 1 to 5. 1, this is the first time you're hearing about design thinking, and 5, you are an expert and you hope that I can teach you something new, which I can. So, Tiffany, what do we have?
I see some 3s, a 22. Oh my.
22.
A 2. Someone's experienced a 3.5, a 4. New person, a 1. Lovely. A couple 4s, 2.5 and a 2. I wonder if you can clear the screen, Keith. I am not able to clear others' drawings at the moment.
There we go. Thank you for that. Perfect.
Great.
All right, so we've got a good range of experience with design thinking. So those of you that are a 3 and above, for the next 3 minutes, you might be thinking, I already know this stuff, but I promise we're going to get past it. I want to make sure that the 1s and the 2s have an understanding of design thinking. So what is design thinking? It's a set of principles for creative problem solving. It's a methodology that asks us to take a step back from the problem that's in front of us and think about the user, think about the learner, the talent, the human on the other end of that problem, so that we are solving problems with them in mind and for them. As a lifelong consultant or career-long consultant, I'm in the habit of, as soon as I hear a problem, I want to immediately start to solve it. I want to go into my toolkit and just figure it out. And design thinking taught me that the important thing to do is to first step back and figure out what it is that human needs. And that's what design thinking is. It's a set of principles for creative problem solving that puts the human at the forefront of everything that we do. And it helps us lead to human-centered products, services, and internal processes. One of my favorite parts of design thinking is that it helps to unlock the needs of our users, of our learners, even when they aren't able to articulate them, which is often the case when we're getting new learning and development requests, or when they aren't even sure what the actual problem is. It really helps us get to that root cause analysis. So what is design thinking? It's a focus on people. 5 phases in design thinking. Empathy, define, ideate, prototype, and test. We start with empathy. We start with understanding our human, understanding our learners, our talent. Once we have done our research and we understand them, we then synthesize that data and we define our problem statement based on what we've just learned. Once we have our problem statement, we ideate, we brainstorm, we come up with tons of great, brilliant ideas, but then we narrow the scope and we prototype the ones, and then we test them back with our users, with our learners. When you look at this, it looks like design thinking is linear, but the reality is it is nonlinear and it is iterative, meaning that any one of these phases can be happening at the same time. So for example, for me, empathy should be happening throughout the entire initiative, and it shouldn't stop there. We should be practicing empathy in everything that we do, especially in our field of talent development, HR, learning and development. When you get to the ideate phase, you might realize, oh, am I even solving for the right problem? Is this even what my learners need? So you go back and you talk with them again, or better yet, you engage them in your ideation phase. And then when you get to the test phase, some of your ideas are going to fail. Absolutely, that's part of the purpose of design thinking. Fail fast, forward quickly, so that you can get up, iterate, and start the process all over again to quickly get to that end solution that meets the needs of the learners. So who can use design thinking? Great question, Tiffany. Anyone, everyone, any industry, any line of business. These are just some quick examples of Fortune 500 companies that use design thinking either in their culture, in their product design, or in their talent and development space. And one of those is General Motors, and that's what we're going to be talking about starting now. So I want to introduce you first to the group that we work with in General Motors. So there's 2 groups in GM. There's your internal business units, HR, IT, technology, all of that. Then we have our retail line, and those are the franchisees. Those are the dealerships that exist across the U.S. So we have about 4,300 dealerships across the U.S. We have about 150 retail employees. And so the group that I work with is called the Center of Learning, and the Center of Learning just focuses on those dealerships. We deliver product training to those dealerships, to the sales consultants, business development specialists, sales managers, retail managers, so that they can sell more vehicles. So we only focus on the dealership side for General Motors. Just want to set that context so you had a little bit of understanding of who it is that we're solving for. I joined the team about 4 years ago, and when I joined, I started asking 2 questions. The first question was, how are we doing from a learning and development perspective? And the answer was, we're great. Our level 1 surveys perfect. The feedback that we get from our dealers, from our learners is really good. They all love our product trainers. Okay, maybe we're not asking the right questions. So the next question is, could we be even better? And that's a question that we should all be asking in the talent development, learning development space. Not even just there. I think that that's a lifelong question that we can be asking ourselves. Could we be even better? And in the L&D space, I believe that the answer is always yes. Our learners evolve, technology evolves, business evolves, our needs evolve. And so we have to evolve to continuously meet the needs of our learners. Talent development, L&D, is not a destination. It's a journey, and we're going to always be on that journey along with our learners. Now, when I ask that question, or maybe some of you, when you ask that question to your business partners, sometimes the response is not too positive. Well, what are you saying? That we're not good? No. We're asking, could we be even better? Is there something else that our learners need that we may not know about, that we could help solve that gap so that they can sell more vehicles, so we can help them with that performance support, performance improvement? And so it took a little bit of coaching to get the team on board with accepting this question, because everybody was very proud, and rightfully so, that our surveys say that we're great. But we can't just rely on those. We have to rely on the discussions, on the empathy research with our learners. And so the team was on board. Tiffany, the moderator today, is part of that team. And she and myself and 8 other people started a design thinking initiative. And the question was, could we be better? And so as we explored, what does that look like? We thought, well, let's look at the lens of just improving the learner experience. And so that's what this design thinking initiative is improving the learner experience. So 10 of us got together. 2 of us had experience, Tiffany and myself, and 8 people didn't. So I share that to say, when you're doing design thinking initiatives, you don't have to have the entire team be experienced and well-versed. You can grow and develop with the team together. It's important just to have some baseline information on what design thinking is so that everybody understands the terminology that you're going to be using. So I usually start with a really quick 1-hour overview of what is design thinking. After we did that, we started our planning phase. And I'm sharing this because even though there's 5 phases in design thinking, there's actually a phase before you even get to empathy, and that's, of course, planning. What is it that you're doing? Why are you doing this? And so for us, that starts with the 5 whys. These are easy to remember. Who, what, where, when, and why. So the first question that we asked was the who. Who are the people? What are we doing this for? And so for us, we need to first identify the design thinking team who's going to be supporting this initiative. So we did that, Tiffany, myself, 8 other people. So now we've got our team. So now who are our users that we want to go out and learn about? And for us, it was the dealership population. So we identified 5 key roles within the dealerships that we wanted to learn about. So then we've got the role names. Now we got to figure out the who. How do we actually identify who we're going to be talking to? So for us, we used data. We identified key characteristics that we wanted to explore to make sure that we were as unbiased as possible, because bias is pretty rampant, or can be pretty rampant, in design thinking. And so we looked at, first of all, who's using technology. So we ran reports from the LMS, who's completing their LMS courses. Then we ran other data like we wanted high-performing dealerships. We wanted low-performing dealerships. We wanted new hires who had been hired in the last 6 months. We wanted people who had been there for over 15 years. So after you identify kind of the role of the people you're looking for, then you've got to identify the characteristics that you're looking for to make sure you're getting a broad range of people so you're getting the most diverse information that you can. So once we ran our data, ran our reports, we figured out the dealerships that we wanted to target, and we identified 5 in each region. The next step, and I don't hear about this enough, is we contacted their leadership first. We contacted the heads of the dealership to have a conversation with them to say, hey, we're from the Center of Learning. We want to help you sell more vehicles. And in order for us to do that, in order for us to make sure that we're giving you the right training, that we're solving those performance needs, we want to come out and talk to your individuals, talk to some of your team members there. Is that okay with you? It's such an important step to get leadership buy-in, not only your own, but also of whomever you're going to be talking to, because the last thing you want is to be having a conversation with somebody and then a manager catch wind of it and get upset and want to know, what are you talking about? Why are you talking to them? Who are you? I want a copy of that data. And then at that point, your initiative, or at least with that individual, is really going to be over, really. Because once the manager gets involved, then it becomes complicated in terms of having that empathy research. So it's really important to get their buy-in first before you start going out and just talking to individual people. So now we know who are. We've talked to the leadership at the dealerships. They've identified the key personnel within the criteria that we had identified. We set up our meetings, and now we're ready to go into the what question. So what do we want to learn? Why are we even doing this initiative? For us, we wanted to learn what motivates people to learn in the dealerships. That's important. We want to help align to that motivation. And then, of course, do they even want to learn? Because some people don't want to learn. So are we spinning our wheels trying to figure out what type of learning they need, and then at the end of the day, they're not even going to take it? Are they tech savvy? What type of technology do they use? This was important because a lot of people look at technology as the solution in L&D, and technology is an enabler, in my opinion. And so it was important for us to figure out, where are they currently savvy with technology? Are we utilizing that? And are we introducing more complex challenges if we're introducing new technology that's not in their flow of work? And then the last was, what currently gets in their way of learning? Because we're doing all these great initiatives and maybe people aren't using them. So let's figure out what gets in their way. So this was the what. Then we have the where. Where are the users? And this is important to make sure that you're looking at, because you don't want to be biased in terms of their physical location, because that could have a definite influence on the data that you're getting back. So we identified 5 regions across the country. And then the when. When are we going to do this? We want to make sure that we set a timeline so that we know when the interviews are, we know when we're going to be synthesizing the data, when we're going to be prototyping and testing, what our time range is. For example, is this just going to be a 2 or 3 day sprint that we're doing with our internal team? Is this going to be maybe a 3 to 4 week initiative like ours was, where we're dispersing and traveling and meeting with a lot of people? And so the when is, of course, important. And then the why. Why are we even doing this? For us, we wanted to improve the learner experience. We wanted to understand our learners even more. And then we wanted to identify champions. And this is important because when you are connecting with your learners or your end users and having this empathy research, you're opening the door to that relationship. And you're able to create that relationship so that you now have a champion that you can engage throughout your journey in L&D with that organization, so that they can help you have a direct connection to the learners. And then for us, it was continuous improvement. Again, could we be even better? So those are really the 4 whys about why we were doing this. So that's our planning phase. Who, what, where, when, why. This planning phase took about a week for us to complete. So once we finish the planning phase, then we start with the kickoff of the empathy phase. And this is where we learn about our audience. Now, we don't kick it off with just going and randomly talking to people. This is the most important phase within design thinking, and it also takes the most amount of preparation work. So empathy is the capacity to understand or feel what another person is experiencing. And so in design thinking, there are 2 major components or benefits, if you will, for empathy. One is it helps to uncover the voice of our learner, of our talent, of our end user. And it helps to remove our own bias, because bias exists in design thinking. Bias exists for us. If you have a brain, you have bias. Now, not all bias is bad, but we need to make sure that we are approaching this as a blank slate, a white sheet of paper. We're going to understand, not to validate. And so empathy research helps us remove our own bias. There tends to be 3 ways that we approach empathy in design thinking. The first is to try it. Put yourself in their shoes. And this is pretty popular with product design and development. You're actually playing with the product or the technology or whatever it is yourself as the user. The second is just looking, observing, being a fly on the wall. This is especially helpful when you're dealing with customers or maybe management issues or employee issues or people. Like, for example, if you're trying to understand why grocery shoppers aren't buying a particular item, you would, of course, just go in and watch and see what's their directional flow. Is there something that's blocking that item So you can just look and observe. And then there's asking, and this is really important. That's the discussion that you have with your end users so that you can learn from their perspective. And number 2 and number 3 are really important together because often what you see people do and what they say they do aren't necessarily the same. And we learned that a lot in the dealerships. For example, we could tell after we were finished who the dealerships were that were low performers just by the fact that when we walked in, the phones were ringing off the hook. There wasn't somebody to greet us. There wasn't a morning huddle. There wasn't that camaraderie between the team members. There was sometimes this microaggressive behavior with signage or coffee mugs that would say things like, coffee is for closers only, things like that. Compared to those that are high performing, they really had that team mentality to environment. And so we could just see that from observing. So those are the 3 approaches to how you practice empathy. What's important to understand, as I mentioned earlier, is it's not just going out and having those conversations with people. We've got to take time to prepare for the interview. So the first thing that we did is we got into a room and we brainstormed, what questions do we want to ask? And this is important because everybody's going to have a little bit of a different angle, maybe what they're trying to validate. And by brainstorming the questions and then reviewing them together, you can figure out where the validation question is versus the understanding, or the leading question, or the bias question. And so we first brainstormed, put all of our questions together. We identified themes so that we could have a logical flow in how we were asking the questions. And then we refined the questions to get rid of all the bias leading questions so that we were just understanding. And then we created an interview protocol, because if you have multiple people going out having interviews, you want to make sure that you have the same story that you're sharing with your interviewees or your researchers. So the next thing that we did, which is really important and often overlooked in the empathy phase, is we actually went out and practiced this. We did rehearsals and dry runs. We broke up into pairs of 2, and we went around and we just started asking people, hey, can I take 5 minutes of your time and just ask you some questions? And it gives us the opportunity to be comfortable and familiar with the questions that we're asking, the flow of our story. It also helped us figure out which questions didn't work, because we learned through that there were some questions where we weren't getting the feedback that we thought we would. So this allowed us to get comfortable, because you don't want to have a 20/20 or a police interrogation style interview where you're looking at the questions, asking, looking, asking. You want it to be a bit conversational, and you want to be comfortable with the vocabulary and the terminology. And the best way to do that is to practice, practice, practice. So we did that. We then narrowed down our questions again. And now we were ready to actually go out and start our interviews. And so for us, we had, again, 10 people. We broke up into pairs of 2, and we traveled around the country. We did the 5 regions so that we made sure that we were unbiased in our regional approach, so that we could get the most amount of data that was universal across the country. And then we had the 5 roles that we were interviewing. So we had a total of 75 interviews. We left on, so the first week was all planning, including the empathy planning that I just talked about. The second week, we left on Monday. We interviewed for Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. We flew back on Friday. So it was about a week of interviews there. So when you're doing the interviews, there's a couple of approaches. Some people like to take handwritten notes. Some people like to type. My preference is recording the session if it's possible, and first if you get permission from the person that you are talking with. And I tend to ask for written permission in an email that I can record the session for transcription purposes only, and then I delete that recording. If they're not comfortable with you recording, or you don't want to record, then have a second person who is that note taker for you, because it is not possible for you to truly listen and engage and have a discussion if you're busy typing or trying to write down what it is they're saying, because your brain is going to be behind, or your hands are going to be behind what they're actually saying. So the best scenario is to have a second person taking notes or recording it yourself. Another tool that we use is the 4-box tool, which is very common in design thinking. And so this is something that we filled out after each of the interviews. And you can really have these be anything that you want. For us, it was, we wanted to know, who am I? Like, what are their characteristics? What's their motivation and goals? What are their friction points? And then what are their key quotes? And this is critical. The key quotes are the best thing that you can get from your empathy research, because it is so much more valuable for you, for your leadership team, for your L&D team, to hear quotes verbatim from the learner rather than what you think, what you hear, what you felt. Their words are much more powerful. The other aspect of the 4 boxes is, at least for us, we then kind of merged them together. We did a lot of synthesis, and we turned them into learner personas. And so I've heard a couple of other people today, especially Betty, talk about the use of a persona. Personas are extremely valuable in the L&D space. A persona is a high-level, almost overview of that role. What's a general representation of that role? And these are valuable because personas can be organic, they can be living on. In fact, it's been a couple of years and we're still using these when we get a new hire who says, hey, what are the technicians like? We can give them the persona that represents a general approach to that specific role. So we created learner personas at that point. That finished our empathy phase. So again, 1 week of planning, 1 week of going out, conducting the empathy research. Then during the weekend, really, we created the 4 boxes, or we turned the 4 boxes into learner personas. Then we came back together Monday morning to start the define phase. And this is where we define the problem statement based on what we've just learned. And so in the define phase, you're unpacking everything that you've learned from your 4 boxes, from your transcriptions, from what you felt, you thought, you heard. And then we're turning those into problem or needs statements. And then we evolve them into how might we questions, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. And then we develop a point of view on the user, which is the learner persona. So for us, we literally got in a room, and a lot of times when you see things about design thinking, you'll see that there's Post-it notes that are often being used. Same thing for us. So we got in a room, we started using all of our Post-it notes and synthesizing our data. So we spent about a day really synthesizing the data in terms of what are the themes that we heard. One thing I don't hear talked about a lot is the qualitative data. So yes, we all use Post-it notes, but you have to go a little bit beyond just a Post-it note because that could be biased as well. So there are qualitative data coding tools out there like Deduce. Tiffany will type this in, D-E-D-O-O-S-E, Deduce, free tool that you can use to help code. You can also use just Microsoft Word, which I did here. So you can kind of see on the right-hand side that I've just highlighted some key themes that I'm hearing consistently throughout that specific interview. Here's a quick example of Deduce in action. You upload the Word documents, and then you go through and you do the same thing. You highlight, and it just helps you identify the themes and create data reports based off of those themes. And nodes is another word for theme. So just want to make sure that we address that. So for us, once we did all of that synthesis with the qualitative data approach, that took about 3 days for us. We then identified 6 key themes that emerged from everything. The first was they did love the product trainers, but they needed help. They needed selling skills. They needed communication skills. They needed relationship building. So we did validate that what we were doing was great, but they did need more help than just that. So we recognized immediately they need power skills training. Learners want to be inspired and they want to be motivated. I think all of us can relate to that. Of course, when we're taking training, we want that. But it was great to hear that from our learners, and we recognize that need. They want the training to be personalized. What we heard from them was, look, veterans who have been here for 20 years are taking the same training as new hires. They shouldn't have to take exactly the same training. They're right. We just hadn't thought about that. So this helped us uncover that. They want flexibility to learn what they want, but what they need, but with enough structure to know where they're going. So basically what that means is in the LMS, at least once a quarter, we would just dump a bunch of courses into their profile, and they would come in one day and all of a sudden they have 12 courses they have to take. They didn't understand necessarily why. They didn't understand, if I complete this, is this going to make me a better sales consultant? Am I going to be able to sell more vehicles? So they were a little frustrated with that, understandably so. They want hands-on and interactive learning. Stop sending me to the back room on the computer to take a course in the LMS. Put it in my flow of work. And then lastly, they understand the concept that training is important, but there was a resounding response that for them, time spent training was time away from selling. And that means that they didn't necessarily understand. If I take this, it's going to help me improve my performance and sell more vehicles. So we took a step back and we looked at all of these. And I want to share with you that just because you uncover something in your themes, in your research, doesn't mean it has to continue in design thinking. If you identify a theme and you already know the solution, take it out of your design thinking initiative and just execute on it. Solve that problem today. And if you look at number one, there's no question about what the answer is for that. They need soft skills training. They need power skills training. So give it to them. And so we did that. We took out number one. We immediately created a team, and they started working on solving this, and they created a sales performance series, sales professional series rather, to help solve for this need. So now that left us with 5. And there was no scientific approach. We just figured out or decided amongst us which ones of these do we think that we can actionably solve in a meaningful time. And so we picked 5 and 6. They went hands-on and interactive learning, and they felt that time spent training was time away from selling. So these were our themes. Oftentimes, themes can sometimes automatically be problem statements. So these are both a theme and a problem statement for us. So at this point, we had our themes identified. We took out the one that needed to be executed immediately. We identified the 2 that we wanted to work on, and then we wanted to turn these into how might we questions. So this is an important activity in design thinking. I love how might we questions. In fact, I have evolved from using it just in design thinking to using it in my everyday life. The reason for this is how might we questions frame up the ideation process, but more importantly, it makes it meaningful and actionable. Let me give you an example. Let's say that we had uncovered that they hate the LMS. So a problem statement could be, our learners hate the LMS. It doesn't feel very actionable. It feels a little bit factual, could be factual, but it's just a problem statement. Versus if I said this, how might we leverage the LMS to create a meaningful experience for our employees? Learners don't like the LMS, or how might we leverage the LMS to create meaningful experience for our employees? As soon as, for me, I hear that how might we question, I immediately start thinking and brainstorming. I'm like, yes, how could we do that? It's like you're asking that question and then you're starting to answer it. Versus the problem statement, statements tend to just stop at the end with that period versus the question. So how suggests we don't have the answer yet. We don't know, but might emphasizes that what we come up with might be a solution, but it's not the only solution. And we means that this is a collaborative experience and we're going to go through this and solve it together. So for us, we had our problem statement. I need to learn from experience so I can apply it as I learn. And so we turned this into a how might we question. So now I'm going to turn it over to you and ask you to turn this into a how might we question. So Tiffany, we're going to go over to the chat. I want you to think about the problem statement. So put yourself in the shoes of the learner. I need to learn from experience so I can apply as I learn. How can we turn this into a how might we statement? Or what type of how might we statement might you use for this problem statement? So what are we saying here? They need to learn from experience so they can apply it as they learn. So you could either raise your hand and come off mute and you could share, or you could share in the chat.
Not seeing any brave hand raisers yet. Let's see if we've got
okay. Anything in the chat?
Dave has said, how might we provide the experiences you need for learning?
Yes, that is an answer. I would say dig a little bit deeper. Like, what do you mean by provide the experience for learning? It's a little bit broad, so I would say narrow it just a little bit.
Okay, we have Sherry saying, how might we create learning experiences that occur while people are working?
Perfect. Absolutely.
How might we create a project-based learning environment?
Okay. And one more.
How might we design, okay, Lisa says, how might we design learning experiences that can be applied directly?
Excellent. Those are all excellent how might we question. So for us, what we went with was how might we give learners experiential ways to learn on their own. So often in L&D, we tend to think that we have to be the ones to create the learning for them. Instead, let's create an environment where they can learn on their own. And then the other was, how might we enable people to learn from others on the job so they can learn from each other rather than us just creating all of that content. So now we had our two how might we questions. You can come up with as many as you want from a problem statement. For us, we chose 2. The next was, time training is time away from selling. So time training is time away from selling. Think about that for a moment, and then let's go into the chat. And I want you to share a couple of examples, please, on a how might we question. So time spent training is time away from selling. What does that mean?
Okay, we've got Teresa saying, how might we link our training to selling in real time?
Perfect. I'm going to go with that in the spirit of time. Yes, absolutely. So how might we, for us, it was how might we change the perception of what training means, because we interpreted this that they didn't value training. So we needed to change that perception. And then how might we provide training that doesn't take them away from their job? So at this point, we have our how might we questions. So now we're ready to move into the ideation phase. So in the ideation phase, it's not about coming up with the right idea. It's about generating the broadest range of possibilities. And so for us, we literally got in a room and we put the how might we questions around one on each wall, and then we started our ideation process. We used a 4-step process: idea share, sketching, storyboarding, voting, and impact and feasibility matrix. So we started first with the basic Post-it notes. We each started coming up with ideas on how we might solve for that how might we question. Once we did it individually, then we created teams. We had 4 teams, and then those 4 teams started sketching out and storyboarding, and these are our actual storyboards. One of those is Tiffany's, one of those is mine, on what it might look like. And then we presented our ideas back to the whole team, and we voted on it. We voted based on what was doable, what's a wild card, what's disruptive that may change the way that we're doing our business. We tallied up those votes, and then we plotted it against a prioritization matrix based on impact and feasibility. What's the likelihood that we could actually accomplish any of these? And so the area that we wanted to focus on was the stars area. That's kind of that risk-reward sweet spot where you're going to make an impact and it is feasible for us to be able to execute. So at this point, we've got our ideas that we're going to move forward with. So now we're ready. I have to skip this for time. Now we're ready to move into the prototype phase once we have these just general ideas and these sketches. And so in the prototype phase, we're building out representations of your ideas. There's typically 2 types of prototypes: low fidelity, cheap, quick, free, if possible, and high fidelity. They tend to be longer, more costly, time-consuming, red tape, you need approvals. In design thinking, we focus on low fidelity prototypes. And so for us, we thought, how might we give learners experiential ways to learn on their own? How might we create a social environment? So if I ask you, what's the most obvious social environment that we all have access to that's free, probably say Facebook. And so that's what we did. We created a private Facebook group so that we could invite sales consultants to create a social network so that they can collaborate and help each other there. Did that in 24 hours, $0. The next one was, how might we provide learning that doesn't take them away from their job? We've got to give them learning in that moment of need. One person on the team had experience with a chatbot. So the idea was, well, could we use a chatbot for learning and development? So we turned to our network, a chatbot provider, and we asked, could you help us with a prototype? We want it for 100 users for a couple of weeks, and they did. And so we set up a chatbot prototype, which I'll talk about in a minute in the test phase. And then the last was, how might we give people the opportunity to learn from each other? Virtual feedback and coaching tool. Our first idea was to develop an app, but luckily there are a number of virtual feedback and coaching tools that already exist. So we reached out to those providers as well, And they were able to help us set up a prototype so that we could test to see if this is viable in our environment. So at this point, it's about a week later, we've got all of our prototypes set, and now we're ready to move into the test phase. And this is where we test ideas, we get our user feedback, we create authentic experiences so that they're testing it in their real world environment. We learn from that, we refine our point of view, and we refine our idea on the learner at the same time. And so for us, the Sell Like We Do social, it took a little bit of time to take off. I'd say about the first 3 or 4 months, it was really slow. There wasn't a lot of engagement. It wasn't until about maybe 6 months later that it really started to be beneficial. We started to see the count go up, and then we started to see this wonderful thing happening. People were posting, "Thank you so-and-so for helping me. I sold a car from what I learned about you." And so what we were seeing is that new hires would come in and say, "Hey, I've been here for 4 weeks. I haven't sold anything. Can somebody please help me?" And someone else would jump in and say, "Oh, yes, here's my best practice. Here's what I do." We acted as moderators. We didn't drive the conversations, the discussions. We just made sure that there was nothing happening that was going against our beliefs, against GM's best practices, things like that. So in 3 years, we've only had to remove 3 people for being inappropriate in the Facebook group. It's been going so well for us that it's now business as usual, and all of the brands have their own private Facebook group where they can help each other in that social environment grow, develop, and share best practices. The next was the chatbot. So we had to figure out, how do we test this? What do we want to do with this? And so for us, we wanted to first figure out, does a chatbot work for learning? Is there knowledge retention, sustainment? And how long do people actually want to use this thing until they're sick of it? So we set up 2 tracks. The first track was for 4 weeks. We text 3 times per week. And the second track was for 2 weeks where we texted every day. So one was longer, spaced out. The other one was shorter. We also did a pre-test for the content, and then we did a post-test so that we could measure, assessment, we could measure whether or not there was any knowledge retention there. What we learned is that many of the people stayed through about 9 chats. So what our data showed us was that 9 chats was really the maximum point that they wanted to be engaged, which is why chatbots are really good for campaign-based initiatives, something that's time-bound, maybe specific content that you're trying to share with that purpose in mind. For those of you who are familiar with an NPS score, we got an NPS score of 69. Now, a 50 is great. So 69, we were blown away. We were so happy with that. But what we learned was that in that shorter duration, they like that shorter duration, but don't text me after hours. Don't text me on my days off, which seems logical. We weren't practicing our empathy when we set this up, but it was a great lesson learned for us. So that's what we uncovered. So what we identified is that those who used it really liked it in our case. We needed to have a good communication plan for people to actually engage with it. The more intense short cycle was preferred, never on the weekend, never after hours, and the knowledge assessment did show that there was knowledge retention gained from using the chatbot for us. So that was a successful initiative. We continue to use chatbots throughout our learning journey with our learners periodically for specific campaign uses. The last was video events, virtual feedback and coaching. And this was the one that my team came up with. And I love this idea, and I still do, but it failed miserably. Just because there is an idea or a technology that may work someplace else doesn't mean that it's going to work in your environment. And for us, we had to take the culture into account. And GM's culture, at least from the dealership's perspective, did not want to be forced to download an app, create a new account, and then log in. The idea of it, everybody loved. But when it came time to loading something on their personal device, they just didn't want to do it. So luckily for us, we didn't spend the time and money creating an app. We figured out early on through the prototype and testing that this is not the right culture for an app that's required to download and log in. The reason the chatbot was so successful is because there's nothing to download. You just use your SMS. You opt in and you opt out. So ease of use, it was in their flow of work because their mobile device is already in their hands. So that's why one was successful and the other one wasn't. I still love virtual feedback and coaching tools, highly recommend them. So for us, this was part of our 3-year journey in terms of our culture, in terms of our learning strategy. We started with design thinking to get the voice of the learner, and it's carried us through for the past couple of years to help change the culture of learning and development at the center of learning. A couple of things I want to share with you. Empathy research takes extreme planning, have dedicated resources, it helps. Create a place to continue fostering design thinking. Don't just let this stop here. It takes a long time to really change the culture to accept and embrace design thinking. So have a reoccurring place where you're talking about business challenges and business needs. During your empathy research, avoid yes/no questions. Be aware of the bias and negative voice. Design thinking initiatives are quick. Usually, I would say the max is about 4 weeks. I've seen it go as quick as maybe 2 days from a sprint. But if you last longer than 4 weeks, sometimes the business partners go out and they solve the problem themselves, or the problem evolves, and then by the time you bring back your ideas, they're like, this isn't even the right problem anymore. And design thinking is not a solution for every problem. As a learning and development practitioner, it's our job to have a toolkit where we have tools in there to solve problems. Design thinking is just one. It's like a hammer. You wouldn't use a hammer just to build a house. Hammer is one tool that you would use. The same for design thinking. With that, I know we're almost out of time here. So started with 2 questions. How are we doing? Could we be better? Tiffany, please share the design thinking resources into the chat. So I download this, save this. It's 2 pages of all of my resources that I use. The first page is everything that will help you in your design thinking journey to be a practitioner. The first one is a website that we've created at GP that has all of our content on it. It's free, access it. It's also important to understand use cases of design thinking. So there's a great blog link that's in there that has 40 success stories of design thinking. The second page is resources to how you deliver and execute design thinking workshops. It's an extremely valuable resource. With that, here are 2 QR codes. The first one is Ahead of Tomorrow. This is the podcast that I have where I talk about, excuse me, topics to help us prepare for and stay ahead of tomorrow, the future of work. Just had 2 episodes come out on design thinking, the bias in design thinking, so check those out. The other is LinkedIn. I'm extremely active on LinkedIn. Let's connect there. Let's continue this conversation there. I know this was quick, but I wanted to put in as much information as I could in 60 minutes to give you a full end-to-end case study of how design thinking works in the L&D space, because there's not enough success stories of that out there. So connect with me on LinkedIn. Let's talk about your stories. If you're having challenges, you want to know how to get started, or you want to just share a story, let's talk there. Tiffany, thank you very much for your moderation today. I would stay for a Q&A, but we're right at the time, so let's connect on LinkedIn, and we'll talk there.